Ryan and I are here with a preview of Mandalorian Adventures.
Yeah.
This one is a Gen Con release. We were lucky enough to get our hands on it a little bit earlier, and we gave it a little play here. We don't want to ruin anything because I'm going to tell you right now, this is a sort of a game you want to experience.
For sure.
It is a campaign sort of game that's definitely going to unveil things as you play. So we're going to tiptoe around it a little bit. Now, with all that said, there is some other... In fact, Rodney has a how to play. So if you want to learn exactly everything you need to know about how to jump in and some of the things that might happen. But we played the first scenario, and I'll be honest with you, we looked into a little bit of the additional future content, because there's a whole deck here that you work yourself through, and at the beginning of the game, you just flip the first card and it says, okay, that's stop.
Yeah, there's a big deck. And we wanted to talk about not necessarily just how to play the game, but the spirit of what the game is offering. And I think right away I want to set the record straight in that my biggest concern, if you watched our other video, was that this was going to feel like a by-the-numbers recreation of the Mandalorian story. And to a small extent, that is the case.
I think it does follow that structure.
You're playing through a series of maps that feature this character and that character in these situations. But what we've seen with this huge guide deck and these envelopes, which there are some envelopes included in the game, they offer a ton of ways to play the game layered on top of, okay, yes, you can play the campaign, you can play the story of the Mandalorian, but instead you can play all of these different, what they call like sandbox modes on top of that. And they've teased that some have hidden traders. There's some that are like mercenaries. There's some that offer like other objectives. And while they're being played on the same map, they're vastly different in gameplay. So I think if that might set some of those concerns aside, and I wanted to do that early in the video.
Yeah, now, not to bring up other concerns, but one thing that we've noticed after reading the rules and taking a look and playing this first scenario is the game does seem to be tooled mostly for 2 players.
Yeah.
You can play it with 4, you can play it with more, you can play it solo, but those feel like slight variants of the core design.
Yeah, now that being said, the additional content feels like it was much more geared towards being 4 players. It's like, if you want to play through this campaign, there are some rules to play solo and there are some rules to play 4, but it definitely feels good as a 2-player game. Each of you getting to control 1 character. There are some rules where you're shuffling all the character decks together, handing out cards, and then everybody, looks at their hand and maybe they can activate specific characters.
It still sounds like an interesting puzzle to solve, for sure.
It definitely is an interesting puzzle to solve. But the 2-player game being like, you have a character, I do, on your turn you get to take 2 actions. So I'm taking 2 actions, David's taking 2 actions, back and forth with our characters. In a 4-player game, it could be that you all end up drawing IG-11 cards, and then IG-11 is taking 6 actions in a row, and the Mandalorian hasn't taken a single action, which, that's fine. I think that doesn't hurt the game at all. And in fact, it could be more fun to play because you're playing with more of your friends.
Different challenge, for sure.
But when it's just you and one other player, you're really getting your heads together and trying to solve some of these puzzles. Like, we got into a situation where IG-11 had 1 health left, and it was like, David, we need to plan out our next few moves, because if we make a misstep, I'm dead and we lose the scenario.
And we did nearly lose the scenario, and it must be said, this is just scenario number 1.
Yeah.
And it was no complete pushover. Now, with that said, we did kind of go through it mostly smoothly.
And recklessly.
And that's true. That's probably the best way of putting it. We went through pretty recklessly. We weren't really thinking about our damage situation. I kind of assumed, well, certainly there'll be some ways to heal. There was some, but not a lot innately built into the game. So we were very close to it, and we did kind of win it. I think if we'd gone 1 more turn, we would have lost it.
Yeah, you have to complete whatever objective is. And again, that's an interesting part of the game that I want to talk about. It's a storybook, and you'll see that storybook in front of you. And there's a whole list of the characters you're playing and the objectives you're trying to complete. And there's a variety of different objectives, and they use tokens in an interesting way. They use cards in an interesting way. There's a bunch of stuff going on, but you have to complete your objective and then survive. Because the turn structure is pretty interesting in that the enemies don't actually get a turn.
No.
There's almost like it feels a little push your luck. I mean, it's not really push your luck, but you kind of get to control when the enemies activate, which we'll talk about. So if you play it right, you might get 2 or 3 turns between you, before the enemies even get to activate.
Yeah, this is an interesting mechanism, and I don't know that we've seen it exactly like this before, because they do act. But like Ryan said, there is not a turn on the little player order card or player aid that says this is when the enemies attack. This is where they took a page out of, if you're familiar with the game, The Initiative, you're playing your cards under these actions here to take the action where you're playing it to the power of the card that you're playing it. On top of that, some of the cards might do extra things if you play them on the right action. But once the card values add up to a certain amount, in this scenario, it was 5 or 6.
I think that's pretty
always
consistent. 5. Except maybe some of the envelope stuff might change that.
But that's when it's going to sort of build up to them triggering. So after you've taken your 2 actions, you go from left to right here and you check to see any of them that have hit 5 or exceeded 5. And then if it exceeded 6 in this case, or 6 or more, you're going to add a token here. Once 3 tokens are there, bad things are going to happen. In this case, it was going to spawn an enemy. Then you also flip over one of these cards, which does a number of different things that are going to activate the enemies. So this is kind of where they're taking their turn, but it does feel very much like they don't have a turn. It feels like they're just reacting to your turns.
And that's the flip side of what I just described, because you might be in a situation where I played a 1 and a 1, and David put a 2 and a 2, and then we're doing really good, and everything's...
And I could just say, screw it, I'm playing this 4.
And then you'll get to a point where everything is at maybe like 3 or 4, and then you have to play 2 cards, and you can end up in a situation where you're triggering 2 columns in one turn, which means they're getting 2 activation cards in between. And we ended up in a situation where I did that, and I thought I was pretty safe, but then the first activation card spawned an enemy, and then the second activation card actually made them attack me, and literally took me to 1 health left.
I do want to point out one clever thing here, and Ryan pointed this out to me while we were playing. That deck of their activations, on the backs of those cards, are symbols related to certain types or classifications of enemies out there. So you can kind of consider that, and we very much did, where we're like, okay, I'm going to take my turn. This is the type of guy that is going to be activating, so I'll take him out.
Sure.
And then when I take him out, I know that I'm going to trigger this, so at the end of my turn, I flip that. He's not on the map, and generally, if you can't execute one of those cards, you then have to spawn another. And thankfully, that's how we kind of extended ourselves without losing any life.
It's very much a puzzle, and like I said, every page in this is going to give you a different objective, some different map rules, some different setup rules, some different characters to even use, and those characters will get upgraded over time. I mean, that's one of the other cool elements. If anybody's played the Initiative, which is by Corey as well, same designer, same publisher, I don't want to say that this feels like it, because the gameplay is nothing like it. But the pacing, the way that this game grows and grows, if you play the Initiative, you'll know what I mean. You get to certain points in the game where you're like, this is not the game I thought it was. There is now another level to the game. And the guide deck that you're playing through, I mean, it's thick. And you're flipping over these cards, and hidden in here are a bunch of
not
new
just
cards.
story cards. Yeah,
not just story cards, right. New action cards.
New action cards, all sorts of things.
New event cards, new rule cards that say, now here's a new rule you're playing with. And then certain things are going to say, open envelope 1 or open envelope 2 or whatever, all mixed in. Once you play through this guide deck, you're done with the campaign. But that's when the game really opens up to like more of that sandbox play.
Yeah, so we haven't gotten there, obviously, but we did take a peek, and we don't want to ruin that for you. But what we will say, it does sound like a lot of games that are campaign style, sometimes they make that promise. From what we've gathered, it looks like this one, they've put in some significant effort to make that extended experience something more worthwhile.
Yeah, and if you really want to, they say just jump right into that. You can just open up these envelopes. There's some new rule sheets in there that give you some new rules to play. There's some overlays that change some of these maps and give you new objectives. And also, like I said, multiple different game modes that kind of benefit from having up to 4 players, including that hidden trader mechanic where you have somebody that's kind of working for the Imperials. That's all really interesting stuff. And if you're the kind of person that's like, okay, I don't really care about playing through the campaign, I don't really care about the narrative, I just want to get straight to it. Yeah, sure, do it. You can just jump right in. But I think there is a huge amount of fun to be had by going through that guide deck and having things fed to you over time and adding different layers to the game as you're playing it.
Yeah, this is a really accessible tactical combat, maybe even more than just combat. We had a lot of combat going on in our first scenario. We had to find some things. There were some tokens we didn't know were on the backs of the tokens because they were randomly put out there. We had to basically find these two things to get access to something to finish things. So it's a really fun, it very much feels like an adventure. So the title Adventures makes very much sense. I do think this is a great way for maybe a family to cut their teeth on this type of game. It feels kind of Jaws of the Lion-ish, just in terms of like the expanding rules and the continuing evolution of the game, not to mention the fact that it just has this storybook is probably triggering that memory for me. But you know, if you have a kid in your house and you're like, I think it's time, let's play something like this. I mean, maybe they're of the age where they just started watching Mandalorian with you. This is like a great game to try out with them.
And this guide deck really does, I don't want to say it holds your hand too much, but it does a little bit, because as you're playing this, as you're flipping it, it'll tell you like, here's setup stuff, here's what you're doing, and it will remind you, if you don't remember what this is, go to this page of the rule book or check this, or here's a reminder. So it's really guiding you, the guide deck, it's really guiding you through the entire process. And it is, like, this first scenario is kind of very basic. So, what you're seeing on here is like, learn how to play, learn how these mechanics work, 4 basic actions. But they've even suggested in the rules that some of these scenarios are going to have more actions. Yeah. Some of these things might change. They might work a little differently as you flip through these pages to other parts of the rule book. You're getting new cards that are going to make your decks a little bit better or a little bit more effective. We've even seen teased some cards that don't follow the normal rules for cards. So there is a lot that gets added on, but you're doing it at your own pace. You can play as much of this in one session as you want, or you can kind of just like pause after every scenario and then come back to it and learn the new rules.
I will say this too, if you are a more experienced gamer and it's still interesting to you to play this game, because it is sort of a more accessible game, but if you're a more experienced player and you're thinking, oh, can I just skip like the first scenario? This is not just a nothing throwaway scenario.
Yeah, there's still a puzzle to solve.
I felt like there was a really solid puzzle to solve. This was a great way, even if you're an experienced gamer, to get comfortable with what this game is doing before you move on. It didn't take very long. There was enough of a puzzle to solve. It felt like we might lose.
We definitely felt like we might lose.
So it felt like this first scenario honestly did exactly what this should do. And like I said at the beginning, as it relates to this guide deck, that was just one card.
Yeah.
Now, we did peek. Some of the next jumps give you a lot more cards, so you're going to be jumping bigger chunks of cards and getting more things out of there. But I was really enthused when Ryan flipped that card, read it, and said, stop, now play the first scenario.
Right.
Now, with that said, you do have to read the rules. This is not a game where you could just put the deck of cards out there and learn as you play.
That's true.
You do have to have the rules at least handy and know a few things about how some of the mechanics work, particularly with the way the threats come out and how the threats operate.
Yeah, though it's very streamlined. I mean, most of what you need to learn to play is right here. If you have somebody that read the rules and you come in and you read the scenario instructions, and each action literally tells you how to carry it out.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, we know how to do that. And then each event card kind of tells you how to make these enemies work. And then the back of the rule book has a breakdown too. So it is very, very easy to learn, very easy to teach, and fairly easy to play. But to David's point, I, as an experienced gamer who plays a lot of these games, still felt like there was a lot of tension, even in this very first puzzle of like, do we push past these guys? Do we stop and fight everybody on the way? Like, do we use the intel action to peek at things, or do we just rush in and hope that they're the thing we need? Like, there's a lot of ways you can kind of plan with the plan action, like, and with the intel action, and make like smarter decisions.
Oh yeah,
which we might have wanted to do a little slower.
We got through it. We
did get through it.
But that's why I wanted to point that out, because when we first flipped this, we both had the assumption, oh, this is probably going to be kind of a throwaway scenario, because it was just one card.
Yeah, like that classic tutorial scenario.
And it is a straightforward scenario, but it wasn't basic. It was a nice puzzle to solve, so it was very satisfying.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to get into these envelopes and really get into some of these game modes, because just from peeking at what some of those modes offer, very cool, both cooperatively and even like introducing competitive modes with this, which could really open the door for a ton of additional content down the line.
Yeah, plus I think it's going to get all gamers, but particularly those new gamers, the people who need a more accessible game, very enthused because it's going to be maybe the first thing that's close. It's not a legacy game, but it's the first thing that some people might experience that's along those lines of a campaign and or legacy game. And it'll be their first chance to experience that, oh, what, I can do this now? Or that's a new rule? That's awesome. I've wanted to do something like that. Or I have new cards that I can use that, oh, wow. I mean, there's some really cool character progression stuff that you're going to experience in the game.
And it's the Mandalorian. So, like, and
Yeah.
again, duh, everybody, like, you know, Star Wars is huge. But that being said, like, if people are fans of the Mandalorian, I always say theme and mechanics, right? You've got all the different characters that are going to be popping up. And it's like you already kind of know what these characters can do because you've seen the show. So it's not like you're having to learn, like, you know, you're not introducing, like, you're the Technomancer and you're the, you know, it's like, what does that do? Like, you know what the Mandalorian does.
Yeah, if you're a
Like,
fan, I mean, if you're playing the game, you're probably a fan. I can tell you there are some cards and some cards that we peeked at that are very cool, very thematic with what they're doing and what you're seeing on the card. So, yeah, it's a really cool game. If you're at Gen Con, be sure to go hunt it down because I think this is going to be one of many games at Gen Con that probably sells out. Hunted down. See what I did there? At least I didn't say this is the way.
Not
made
yet.
it through this whole thing without saying that. But yeah, look for it at Gen Con. But if you have any questions about it right now, please make them in the comments below. We'll get down there and answer whatever we can. Until next time, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then.